Welcome to week 5 of COMS 246, where we are going to discuss value orientations and behavior in chapter 5 of the textbook. At the end of this chapter, you should be able to identify Hofstede's 5 dimensions of culture, compare Kluckhohn and Strodbeck's value orientations, explain Schwartz's cultural taxonomies, and explore and apply ethical principles in intercultural communication. This chapter focuses on the relationship between value orientations and behaviors, including communication behaviors. It describes the widely known cultural dimensions developed by Hofstede and his associates, including value orientations proposed by Kluckhohn and Strodbeck, and explains Schwartz's cultural value theory. The chapter then outlines the ethical principles governing intercultural communication. This chapter enables you to recognize that values, which are concepts that have ultimate significance and are of long-term importance, provide criteria for us to evaluate our own behaviors and those of others. Essentially, value orientations influence how we communicate with others. Let's start by talking about Hofstede's cultural dimensions, or Hofstede's taxonomies. In a study of 160,000 IBM employees in 53 cultures, Hofstede suggested that there are 4 overarching cultural dimensions, which have a significant impact on behavior in every culture. Later, he added a 5th dimension, long-term and short-term orientation. The first dimension that Hofstede introduced was individualism collectivism. In individualistic cultures, emphasis is placed on individuals' goals, abilities, and aptitudes over those of the group. In contrast, collectivistic cultures emphasize values that serve and preserve the in-group by subordinating personal goals to this end. Group membership is more important than individuality. Responsibility is shared and accountability is collective. Essentially, in an individualistic culture, you are worried about I, and in a collectivistic culture, you are worried about we, worried about the group. The next dimension is masculinity and femininity. In masculine cultures, people strive for maximal distinction between gender behaviors and expectations, and a greater value is placed on masculine traits. Cultures labeled as feminine are those that permit more overlapping social roles and place a high value on feminine traits. The masculinity-femininity dimension is definitely the most outdated cultural dimension. The third dimension deals with power. And to understand the power distance dimension, it's important to think about power as Foucault describes it. Foucault argues that social hierarchies are always present in human communication. It's important to think about where power is located, who has power and who does not have power, how power is distributed, how those in power obtain and keep power, and to what and whose ends power is used. So with that in mind, we're going to talk about power distance. Power distance refers to the extent to which a culture tolerates inequality in power distribution. In cultures with a larger power distance, inequalities among people are both expected and desired. People are expected to display respect and conform to status differences. Cultures with a smaller power distance de-emphasize and minimize inequalities. Power distance also refers to the extent to which power, prestige, and wealth are distributed within a culture. Cultures with high power distance are often characterized by authoritarian social relationships and have power and influence concentrated in the hands of a few. On the other hand, low power distance cultures are characterized by horizontal social relationships, which tend to minimize differences of age, status, and racial roles. So let's look at some examples of power distance relationships. So in the family relationships, like parent-child, high power distance relationships, children may be expected to obey their parents without question or challenge. In low power distance, children are taught to seek reasons or justifications for parents' actions. So you may be able to recognize if your family was high power distance or low power distance. And here's some examples from education and business. This dimension of uncertainty avoidance reflects a culture's tolerance for ambiguity and acceptance of risk. High uncertainty avoidance cultures have a high need for information and certainty, and members are actively security seeking. These cultures also tend to be collectivistic. So high uncertainty avoidance cultures tend to be collectivistic. In low uncertainty avoidance cultures, which are commonly individualist, members are more comfortable dealing with diversity, ambiguity, and risk. And here are some characteristics of uncertainty avoidance cultures. This dimension is also known as Confucian work dynamism. And this refers to dedicated, motivated, responsible, and educated individuals with a sense of commitment and organizational identity and loyalty. Long-term orientation encourages thrift, savings, perseverance toward results, ordering relationships by status, and a willingness to subordinate oneself for a purpose. Short-term orientation, which characterizes Western cultures, is consistent with spending to keep up with social pressure, less saving, and preference for immediacy. Value orientation theory was developed by Kluckhohn and Strodbeck. And Kluckhohn and Strodbeck argue that all human cultures are confronted with universal problems emerging from relationships with fellow beings, time, activities, and nature. The means by which these universal problems are solved within a cultural context reveal a culture's value orientations. And so they came up with 5 orientations. Man-nature orientation addresses the question, what is the relationship of human to nature? A society's conception of the relationship of human to nature is determined by the worldview of its people. Man-nature relationship can be subjugated to, in harmony with, or mastery over nature. Activity orientation addresses the modality of human activity and refers to the use of time for self-expression and play, self-improvement and development, and work. This orientation is particularly evident in a culture's concept of work. Time orientation refers to the temporal focus of human life. Cultures differ widely in their conceptions of time, and time orientation can be focused on the present, past, and future. Hall categorized time orientations into polychronic and monochronic. People from monochronic time orientations view time as linear and tend to do one thing at a time. So that's monochronic. Whereas people from polychronic time orientations view time as cyclical and will attempt to perform multiple tasks simultaneously. Human nature orientation addresses the innate nature of humans. Are we born good or evil, or a mixture of good and evil? Is there potential Is there potential for the individual to choose and achieve one over the other? Differences in human nature orientation can often be reflected in a society's dominant religion or in its criminal laws. Relational orientation addresses the modality of a person's relationship to other people. It refers to perceptions of the self and the ways in which society is organized. It can be lineal, collateral, or individualistic. In individualistic cultures, people are encouraged to accept responsibility as independent individuals. In collectivistic cultures, individuals subordinate personal needs to their in-group, particularly those of the family. Finally, we'll discuss Schwartz's cultural taxonomy. Schwartz argues that there are 7 types of values, which are then summarized into 3 dimensions related to universal issues confronting all societies. First, autonomy versus embeddedness. This issue involves the nature of the relation between individuals and the group. In autonomous cultures, people are more independent, they find meaning in their own uniqueness, they're encouraged to express their own preferences, traits, feelings, and motives. In contrast, cultures that are oriented toward embeddedness view the culture as an entity embedded in the collectivity and find meaning in life largely through social relationships. Then there's hierarchy versus egalitarianism. This issue refers to how societies guarantee responsible behavior that will preserve the social fabric. Cultures that value hierarchy view the unequal distribution of social, political, and economic power as legitimate and desirable, preferring compliance with obligation and rules. On the other hand, cultures that value egalitarianism believe that responsible social behavior can be induced by encouraging people to recognize one another as moral equals who share basic interests and by encouraging voluntary cooperation with others that transcend selfish interests. The final issue refers to how humankind relates to nature, mastery versus harmony. Mastery cultures encourage people to actively control and change the world, and to exploit it in order to advance personal or group interests. A culture that values harmony with nature encourages acceptance and fitting harmoniously into the environment. As humans are viewed as an integral part of nature, unity with nature, protecting the environment, and a world of beauty are valued. So by understanding those 3 different ways of understanding value orientations, you may be able to understand some of the social problems that we see in the world. They are fundamentally different understandings of cultural dimensions. If 2 people or 2 groups of people are on opposite ends of mastery versus harmony, they're going to have a clash in communication. So it's important to have intercultural communication ethics principles. Ethics is concerned with the standards and rules that guide our behavior. Communication ethics is concerned with how we enact communication and the consequences of our communication behaviors, which are influenced by the ethical standards of culture. There are 3 approaches to ethics. Proponents of ethical universalism believe there's a universal ethical principle that guides behavior across all societies at any time. Therefore, what's wrong in one place will be wrong in all times, all places, all circumstances, every country. Proponents of ethical relativism deny the existence of a single universal set of values and norms, and instead propose that values and norms are relative. Thus, one culture cannot be judged by the standards of another, and to do so is to risk conflict and misunderstanding. Scholars propose a communicative approach, which recognizes that humans are products of their culture, but are capable of critically reflecting and changing the norms and values into which they've been socialized. A communicative approach views ethics as dynamic and changing. There are 4 principles that govern intercultural communication in this vein. First, mutuality. We should locate a common space based on reciprocal understanding of each other's perspectives. Non-judgmentalism. We should be willing to express ourselves openly and be open-minded to others' behaviors. Honesty. We should see things as they are rather than as we would like them to be. And respect. We should develop sensitivity to understand and acknowledge other people's wants and needs. In your reading of chapter 5 and in today's lecture, you should be able to discuss and understand Hofstede's cultural dimensions and how they're used in cross-cultural research, Kluckhohn and Strobeck's theory of value orientations, Schwartz's cultural taxonomies, and the general principles governing all ethical intercultural communication. This week, I want you to think about, of the 4 ethical principles identified, which do you consider the most important in intercultural communication?